We continue in 2 Samuel 14 today in a relatively short passage as we simply look at 14:9 to 11, because next time we're going to look at this big speech of the woman that follows what happens here that's parallel to Nathan's speech when he tells David, "You are the man," after the parable of the rich man, poor man, ewe lamb, and traveler. So to set us up where we're going, we've been looking at these series of questions. Today we're on number 13, and this is what we're going to be doing, interpreting this seemingly confusing exchange here. And we've also been looking at the parallels here between the story in chapter 11 and 12 and here, and this is exactly where we're at here, where David says he would bring justice against the person, against the injustice of the rich man who took from the poor man to give to the traveler, and here he's suggesting the same thing, and that leads in both cases, as we'll see next time, to the accusation. We've also been looking at the parallels between our two chapters, and this is where we are here, that David is being deceived into accepting her story as truth, as Tamar was deceived into making and offering the food to Amnon. We've been looking at this shape of the story, and as I've been noting on the previous videos about this episode, there's no real chiasm for this larger part, but the key words are so key, and in many ways, as a number of commentators have noted, the woman here's speech parallels Abigail's in 1 Kings 25, especially around the exact phrase, "May the guilt be on me," as she says right here, as we'll see. And notice how often she refers to "my lord the king," exerting his authority, and that will come up here in relation to Yahweh's authority, because as we noted earlier in the last video, the fact that he's giving orders or commandments is something attributed to God in Genesis, and the whole scene about justice here is suggesting that the king is usurping Yahweh's authority all the way back to 1 Samuel 8. So where we left it off last time after verse 8, David didn't know what to do in response to the question that the woman presents. The conundrum, of course, is that she has one son left, who the redeemer of blood, the one who provides vengeance on behalf of the Mishpah, the clan, against somebody who kills a member of the community. If that person is killed, her only son, then she has no one to take care of her as a widow and no one to remember her husband's name, and the Levirate understanding that we see played out in Genesis 38, even though there's no legal reference to that here. So Joab has set a problem for David via this woman that has no obvious solution. If he says he'll protect the person, as he says he will here, then that will anger the Mishpah and perhaps raise them against the king in jealousy and seek vengeance against the king. If he lets the person die, then he's ignored this poor widow's plea and left her bereaved. So why has Joab set up the king with such an impossible task? Is it because he's trying to show that David has no sense of justice? That's plainly not the issue. Joab is not about something abstract like that. The issue is about Absalom. As we saw at the beginning, he knew that the king's heart was either on or against Absalom. So as far as we can tell, Joab's goal is to get Absalom back safely. But to do that, the king has to acknowledge that he's responsible for it somehow, or that's the right thing to do. Just as Nathan had to get him to acknowledge that taking from the poor man, as he did relatively with taking from Uriah compared to David's role as king, was the wrong thing to do. So let's see how that plays out as she continues to speak here in verse 9. And as Graham Auld notes below, as she persists, the Tekoa woman shows that she might have been trained by Abigail. She starts the appeal she has really come to make here in verse 9, just like Abigail, "On me be the guilt," and chooses "my lord the king" more densely 9 times than any other speaker apart from Abigail 15 times. Each has her good sense, wisdom, proclaimed by the narrator before she goes on to demonstrate it. But the Tekoite goes beyond Abigail in accepting any guilt. And it's parallel to 2 Samuel 3:28 in an important way that we'll look at again in just a minute. So again, the narrator reminds us of where she's from, the woman of Tekoa, although in the third round we won't hear that. Said to the king, "On me be the guilt." As Shipper notes, her statements in verse 9 provide David with his first clue that she speaks for Joab, since the verse sets up a contrast between herself and David, which is to say, not on the king, but on her. Let's look carefully at the language of this, because there's some important echoes once we see that. The word that's translated guilt, ha'on, really means inequity or punishment. It's not guilt in the sense of a court finding someone guilty as opposed to not guilty. It's what happens as a result in the sense of punishment, or iniquity as parallel to something like sin, as we see in Genesis 4:13, which is very fitting. Let's go back and look at that, since it's parallel to the Cain and Abel story. Cain says to Yahweh, my punishment is greater than I can bear, using that exact same word there. So it ought not to surprise us that although the word is used 233 times in the Masoretic text, that it's found there in the story in Genesis that was written certainly to echo this. And we see it a number of times. It's used so many times that I didn't lay those all out here. But as my note continues, it's assuming the king will rule in a way that implies responsibility for a violent action, or from another angle, guilt for an unavenged murder. So, on me, she says, on my lord the king, suggesting, of course, that she's willing to take on the guilt in order to save her son, the inequity of having, not the inequity of murder, but the inequity of breaking the cycle of needing vengeance against the killing in the first place. And on her father's house, which has a very interesting echo that we'll look at in just a minute, also back to 329. Two echoes back to 329, so we really need to look at that. And her father's house is in opposition to the clan, the Mishpahah, who threatened her other son. We noted last video about the Mishpahah as the social unit in between the father's house and the tribe, Shevet in Hebrew, and that's lower than the nation. And in the king's social structure, those traditional forms of organizing people to people are replaced by cities, and we'll see in Solomon by tax districts. We'll see that in 1 Kings. So she was willing to take the guilt on her father's house. Of course, this is all fiction. None of this is a true story. It's a story that Joab has told her. Let the king and his throne, and this is the first time we're seeing this, Kisei David here, the throne of David. We've seen throne a number of times as seat. Eli sitting on a seat and falling off his seat is symbolic of losing the power of priesthood. But it's office of the king here, and we see it for the first time. So the idea of the throne as a seat of power only emerges finally in the succession. The word for guiltless is not paired with the word for guilt here. It's naki, and it can mean free or exempt in a completely separate concept. So if there's a task or responsibility put on somebody and somebody's exempt, this is the word applied, which has nothing to do with guilt. But it has a lot to do with sharing innocent blood. So let's look at the uses of it that way in the Deuteronomistic history. And it provides a very interesting insight to what's going on within the fictional story that we're seeing unfold here. So back in Deuteronomy 19, this is around the provision for sanctuary cities, not a sanctuary city as it may be used in our current context, which is a place for immigrants to avoid the immigration authorities, but where murderers can find sanctuary against precisely this, against the Redeemer. So in this context, it's calling for adding 3 more cities to the 3 already named earlier in Deuteronomy 19. So the blood of an innocent person, and here's Naki here, may not be shed in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you as an inheritance, thereby bringing blood guilt upon you. In other words, it would bring blood guilt on the people if they killed an innocent person that way, not a murderer who would not be an innocent person. But if someone at enmity with another lies in wait and attacks and takes the life of that person and flees, then the elders of the killer city shall send out the culprit taken from there and handed over to be put to death. In other words, this is plainly not an innocent situation where someone has killed someone by accident and the people want to come back at them in some way. This is clearly a case of what we would call premeditated murder, and therefore that person should certainly be destroyed. Then we see later in Deuteronomy 21 a similar situation. Absolve, O Yahweh, your people Israel, whom you redeemed. Do not let the guilt of innocent blood remain in the midst of your people. Then they will be absolved of blood guilt. So you shall purge the guilt of innocent blood from your midst. So again, that sense of purging the innocent blood but prosecuting the guilty. Later in Deuteronomy, cursed be anyone who takes a bribe to shed innocent blood. So obviously there'd be situations where people in power could be paid to kill someone inconvenient to someone else, and of course they say no to that. All part of Deuteronomy's mixed what I call religion of empire and religion of creation approach, which accepts violence and commands violence in certain ways, but also has certain justice rights. So turning to Samuel, it's not used in Joshua or Judges at all in this way. We saw earlier in 1 Samuel 19 where Jonathan is appealing to Saul on behalf of David, whom Saul is planning to kill, And Jonathan says, David took his life in his hand when he attacked the Philistine, and Yahweh brought about a great victory for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against an innocent person by killing David without cause? And then this is the passage I really want to draw attention to. I referred on the left side here in 2 Samuel 3:28. Let's look at the full passage, because there are layers and layers going on here that might tell us something about Joab's intention or not, depending upon how we interpret this. So when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gateway to speak with him privately, and there he stabbed him in the stomach, so he died for shedding the blood of Asahel, Joab's brother, which takes place in the preceding scene, when Asahel was chasing down Abner. Afterward, when David heard of it, he said, I and my kingdom are forever innocent before Yahweh for the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May the guilt fall on the head of Joab and on all his father's house, and may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge, or who is leprous, or who holds a spindle, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food. So Joab and his brother Abishai murdered Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel in the battle at Gibeon. In other words, Joab did exactly what's at issue in the story he puts in the mouth of the woman here. He kills someone for killing his brother. And David declares innocence of that and instead calls down the guilt on the house of Joab, much like the woman calls down the guilt on her father's house. Are these still the words that Joab has put in her mouth so that David can remember what he said there? Now, did Joab take that seriously back in chapter 3? Or is Joab already alert enough to know this is for public consumption? That David is disclaiming this, even though Joab and David both know that the death of Abner works for David, because Abner was a potential rival, as it was seen in the earlier chapters in 2 Samuel, trying to take up the mantle of the dead Saul. Joab there could understand that David has no intention and is really not calling a curse down. This is for public consumption, that he's disclaiming that, even though Joab knows he's in on it. Or maybe not. Maybe David is honestly doing this here and upset at Joab, but Joab sticks around, and he's been sticking around all this time, and much time, of course, has passed. So, is Joab's intention now to bring this back on David, to bring guilt on his house, or to acknowledge the difference if she's still speaking the words that he put in her mouth? But we don't know that. We don't know if she's being faithful, and that Joab anticipated that David's first response would be a dithering, let me think about this and I'll get back to you. We simply don't know, and we don't know Joab's intention. So much mystery going on that allow us to read the story in many different ways. Continuing down to see just a couple other remaining elements of how the word Nake is used. At the end of the monarchy, Manasseh, who's not the final king, but was there before to explain why Josiah's behavior that the Deuteronomistic historian praises above any other king isn't enough to save the people, that Manasseh's iniquity is worse. And it's described as shedding innocent blood until he'd filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. Notice not in war. That killing in war is celebrated. David has killed his tens of thousands. But that's decided at the end of 2 Kings as the cause of the impending exile. The sins of Manasseh, for the innocent blood that he'd shed, he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and Yahweh was not willing to pardon. So if we return back to our text and back to our story, we realize if we go back up to what she said about the situation, we realize we have no idea when they quarreled, one killed the other, of what the quarrel was about, or whether there's guilt there or not. What was the one who was killed saying to the other? That's all left out. And so we're not able to determine here whether there's guilt or innocence in between them, other than the sheer fact of the killing. And it's certainly, the way she says it, is not that it was an accident. It's certainly intentional. And obviously Absalom's killing of Amnon was intentional, although it's not prefaced by any of this. It's not the direct story. So let's continue back down in our passage and hear how, having looked at that word in depth, how that plays out here. So, on me and my house be the guilt, my lord the king, but not on the king and his throne. So having said that, the king responds again. And as Halberstam and Holmes note again, we saw a nice quote from them in the previous video in this section, in taking upon herself the guilt of unavenged blood, the Tekoite woman cleverly recast David's hesitation in ways that would prompt him to respond favorably to her plea. By offering the king her protection, that is, from the attribution of guilt, the poor widow compelled him to reassert his own role as protector of the weak and vulnerable. After all, the woman appealed to him at the beginning of her approach by the direct and immediate plea, "Help, O king." So here's his response. If anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again. Literally, as Ald notes below, whoever is speaking to you. But is that the issue? As my note below has, she has never claimed any personal harm. The concern is with her son. She's not trying to save herself. She's trying to save herself, but she's trying to save herself by saving her son, so her son can be her protector. And as a widow woman by herself, not being touched is not nearly good enough. She would have no source of sustenance at all. So David yet again has missed the point. And so she continues, and as Shipper notes, suggests she feels David has not grasped her concerns up to this point. That certainly seems to be the case. So then she tries a different tack. Please, may the king remember Yahweh your God. Literally here, not keep him in mind, but remember. A key word that Yahweh remembers the suffering of the people, as we see at the end of Exodus 2, that brings about the call of Moses. So remembering is key throughout the Hebrew Bible, remembering one's covenant, one's promises, but also remembering what one owes others. So may the king keep Yahweh your God, first mentions here since 1225 in the context of Nathan explaining his story there, as well as in the aftermath, the death of the love child and the birth of Solomon. And the next live presence of Yahweh is all the way into chapter 21. Yahweh has not been a live character, as I've noted throughout much of this situation here. My note below continues, by bringing up Yahweh, the woman reminds the king of the source of his authority to wield justice. So by remembering Yahweh, you, O king, are in Yahweh's place. You must provide justice here, so that the avenger of blood may kill no more. Although the Masoretic text, the Hebrew here, is ambiguous, as Ald notes, providing a couple of translation options for if the blood kinsmen multiply among the neighbors, or not multiplying, the blood kinsmen destroying, or you will not, in the second half, you will not take out my son, or they will wipe out my son. So either of those ways we can translate this. But the word for avenger of blood, Goel, here is a redeemer. It's only here in Samuel. It's only one time in 1 Kings, 5 times in the total Deuteronomy and Joshua. As Ald notes, he is a close male relative with the duty of righting the wrong experienced by the family. So a member of the Mishpachah in that sense. And that's what we call, that's the word that Ald is using for family here. It was translated in the RSV, but the Mishpachah, the clan. So may kill no more. In other words, to break this cycle, and my son not be destroyed. No, she's asking very specifically, what I want you to do is make sure that my son is not killed. Use your royal power to protect not me directly, but my son. And he responds, as Yahweh lives, taking an oath in Yahweh's name, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. And oh, the delicious and terrible irony of that. It's a proverbial phrase, as you can see in my note below, but darkly ironic given Absalom's hair and the manner of his death. We'll see in 1426, we'll note ahead, about the weight of Absalom's hair and how important it is, and we'll see in 18:9, spoiler alert, that Absalom is killed when he rides his mule through a tree, and his hair is caught on the branch of the tree, and he hangs there. So his hair will not fall to the ground. He will not fall to the ground. He'll be stabbed hanging there, and then stones piled on top of him. So as my note below continues, the word for hair here, sa'ara, oddly not used in the description of Solomon. As Shipper notes, he may be subtly acknowledging that he knows the intended topic of conversation does not involve the wise woman of Tekoa's family, but rather his own family. Maybe he's getting there, maybe not quite yet. But what exactly is he proposing to do? As making this promise, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground, how is he going to make that happen? Is he promising to station a guard forever outside her house? Is he going to make a public speech that if anybody dares to touch her son, he'll have to face the king? Is he going to talk to the Redeemer and try to talk him out of it in some way or offer him something? None of that is known, and maybe David doesn't even know. He offers a protection without any kind of mechanism to do that. Is it the answer Joab is seeking to evoke? She now turns like Nathan to speak directly about the king's own behavior. And that's where we'll take it up next time, when she dares to speak again and outs him as being the one of whom she's speaking. We'll see you for that next time. Take care.